Hello and welcome everyone. So you don't know me, my name is Christianne Squires and I am here with the lovely, beloved Jan Richardson to celebrate with her the release of her new book, Sparrow. She had the thought during this time when we can't be in person seeing folks with the release of a new book to do some kind of a video conversation to share with her peeps, which is all of you. So she invited me, her friend and also editor who has worked with her on Sparrow and on 2 of her previous books, to just have a little bit of conversation today about this beautiful book and help you guys feel connected to what this book is about and Jan's heart for writing it and wanting to share it with all of you. So thank you, Jan, for inviting me to have this conversation with you today.
Christianne, thank you so much. I am so pleased to be having this conversation with you today and so very grateful for the amazing experience of working with you on Sparrow as my editor and friend who has seen so much of Sparrow unfold firsthand and who really, who has had such a heart for Sparrow from the beginning and who I think perhaps saw Sparrow even before I did. So I am so pleased to be in conversation with you today and so grateful for you.
I'm grateful too. Well, we've got just a couple questions that we formulated for this conversation. The first is to talk about the title, Sparrow, and the image that adorns the cover of the book, which is a nest. So I'll just hold it up again for folks. This was actually designed by you or drawn by you, which I love that little extra fun fact about the book. And that at the beginning of the book, you also, in introducing the book to the readers, describe the book itself as a nest. So we've got the sparrow and the nest image, and then talking about the book itself as a nest. And I wondered if you could just share with folks the meaning of these images for the reading of the book.
There are, thanks for that question. There are lots of tendrils and threads that go into how the nest image came to be important for me, as well as giving the book the title of Sparrow. Although I think I had the Sparrow title long before I had a sense of what the book actually was.
Yes. That is true.
A book called Sparrow, and those tendrils and threads really have their beginnings in a beautiful psalm that was a favorite for Gary and me. It's Psalm 84, and it's a psalm where the writer of the psalm is trying to describe this intense longing he has to be in the presence of God, to be in the courts of God. And he offers these images of the sparrow who makes a home for herself and the swallow who makes a nest for herself and for her young on the very altars of God. They're in the presence of God. And there was something about that image that was really compelling for Gary and me. It resonated for us. And I think it said, in addition to speaking to us of the kind of home that God invites us to share with God, it spoke to us of the kind of home that we had found in each other and the kind of home that we were making together. When we got married, we invited our friend Brenda to read that psalm at our wedding because that really spoke to our experience of finding a home in each other. And that same psalm, it was Psalm 84, that inspired Gary to write one of my very favorite songs of his, which is saying something because I have many favorite songs of Gary's. He was an amazing singer-songwriter, and that was a particular favorite. He titled the song, "I Will Be a Sparrow," and that sparrow, that nest building, home finding in the presence of God, sparrow, it makes its way through that song. And when it came time to plan Gary's memorial service, which unfortunately happened just a few years after our wedding. My pastor friend who was officiating the service encouraged me to think about opening the service with a recording of one of Gary's songs. And that was the song that kept coming to mind, that "I Will Be a Sparrow" song, where Gary sings, "I will be a sparrow until I appear before you. I will be a sparrow, and the altar of the Lord will be my home." I found that in the months after Gary's death, sparrows began to show up with this odd frequency. Physically, they would kind of fled across my path, but also sparrows would show up in books and poems and other pieces that came my way with mysterious timing in the wake of Gary's death. And I finally came to see them as that those sparrows were somehow an image of the mystery that was continuing to unfold in the midst of horrendous loss, and that those sparrows, in the way they reminded me of that sparrow from Psalm 84 who made its nest in the presence of God, they came as a reminder of the provision that continues even when our life has come apart. And so they became a powerful witness to the ongoing presence of mystery and of provision in a time of such rending. And they became kind of a testimony to that ongoing love and grace and sheltering that were becoming part of, that were still part of my life in a new way as I was having to rebuild and remake the nest of my life. I should also say, in thinking about giving Sparrow being the title of the book, that the Sparrow title is also a nod to Jesus' words in Matthew's Gospel, where we hear Jesus talk about how that not one sparrow falls to the ground without God being aware of it. And on the surface of Jesus' words, that's really comforting to know that there's nothing that can happen in our lives. There's nothing that can happen to us. There's nothing that can befall us that lies outside the circle of God's love and grace and desire to shelter us. But at the center of Jesus' words, there's this message that strikes me as really chilling, and that's that the sparrow still falls, even when God is watching, even when God knows it. And that raises all kinds of questions.
Yeah.
And those questions are part of Sparrow too, because I think that's part of how we find our way when our lives have come apart. Questions are part of the way that we continue to find our way.
And questions are such a key part of this book. And so, because you are asking
so many questions.
Yeah. And then I had two other noticings as you were sharing that I wanted to just name for the folks. The first is that, you said sparrows started showing up, in your life, and other kinds of messengers, that were greeting you and helping you find your way. And so many of those stories are in the book. And so folks can get to hear more about what that was like for you to experience that, and also find them as, little markers or teachers for you, or invitations for you along the way. The other thing that I was noticing as you were sharing about the Psalm and the making of the nest, and then Gary's song and his, the home building and the finding of the pieces that build the nest, is that's so much of what the journey is of this book, is the building of the nest of home in the loss of Gary. And so that's really the story of the book, is what is home? How do you make a home? How did you begin to find your way? So yes, thank you for sharing all of those lovely pieces with us. The next question I have for you is about something you shared when you announced the book publicly to folks and said, hey, this is happening right now. I want to shout it from the rooftops, but I also kind of want to just whisper it to you. And that is, this book is coming, and you said that it was your most personal book. And what was the other thing? It's different from anything you've written before. And I wondered if you could just elaborate on that a little bit more for folks, of what does it mean for it to be a different kind of thing than you've ever written before, and your most personal book?
Thanks. Yeah, that tension that you talked about when I first announced Sparrow, that tension was so strong, of wanting to shout from the rooftops, because when you have a new book, that's something you want to tell people about. But this one was, I also had that impulse to just want to whisper the news and be really quiet about it, and maybe not tell too widely about it, because it is the book is so tender for me and so very personal for me. I would say that this book, and I've written a lot about grief in the wake of Gary's death. I couldn't help but find my way into my work, and that's one of the ways that I live with my grief and travel with my grief and work with my grief is by bringing words to bear, even in those times when it seems like I can hardly find what is to be said about the sorrow and the pain that we feel, but that feels an important part of it. And but it's I would say my grief is at its most raw here in Sparrow, in the way that I write so personally about it. And part of what's different about this book from my other books is that I didn't know that I was writing a book when I set out, or at least I didn't know I was writing a book that was going to be published one day. What became Sparrow began as notes that I wrote to Gary when he was in the hospital after he had this surgery that went disastrously, and he was in a medical coma. And so I opened up a file on my laptop and began making notes to him, just trying to, making a list of the things that were happening to him and things that I wanted him to know about what had happened when he woke up and began to recover. The notes about the surgeries and procedures that were happening and the amazing staff that took care of him and the family and friends who came to be with us. I wanted to tell him all these things, and of course I didn't get a chance to do that, at least not in the way that I anticipated. And then about 6 months after Gary died, I went back into that file in my laptop for the first time, back to those notes I had begun writing to Gary in the hospital. And I began writing again to him, still using that second person, writing to him. And as I wrote, it all began to come out, all the pain, all the grief, all the ache of absence that I was experiencing in the wake of his death. All of that found its way into those pages. But I also found that in those pages, I could tell him stories of the moments of grace that were weaving themselves through my days, and the connections that were happening, and the life that was continuing to make itself in an entirely unexpected but new way in the wake of his death. And those pages were a place where I could tell him about learning how stubborn hope was proving to be. Hope has proved to be fiercely stubborn for me. It keeps coming around, and all those are some of the things that made their way into the pages of what eventually became Sparrow. And I found, as I continued to write in those pages, as I kept showing up at those pages and just saying what was and telling Gary what was, including all those questions that I was carrying, I found that I began to have the sense that there was some kind of conversation taking place. And I'll say that conversation is perhaps an overly precise term, overly precise word to describe what was what continues to be a wildly imprecise experience. I would call it, it's the word that I use to describe the sense of exchange and engagement that continues to happen with Gary, and using a language that, finding a language, using a language that takes the form of things like, intuition and impressions, and those marvelous moments of synchronicity that have happened along the way, and poetry and dreams. And I think ultimately that's part of what makes the book so different. Not just that it conveys some of the rawest moments of, rawest, most honest moments of my grief, but also because it became this kind of nest, this kind of shelter that could hold me and could hold my questions and could hold that conversation that was happening with Gary. And this book invites others into that conversation in a way that feels very vulnerable for me and a little scary, very tender. That's part of the tender, but also in a way that feels very hopeful for me to get to have other people be part of that conversation.
Well, and I will just say the incredible generosity of you, your spirit, your heart, to let people into that very intimate conversation that you were having with Gary on the page. all that time that you did not know these were going to become words other people would read. So much of what you have written publicly about your experience of grief and what you've been learning about grief since Gary's death have been offered in the form of blessings that kind of came to take up the previous book you published, which was The Cure for Sorrow, that are such gifts to people who are experiencing that too, or know someone who is. How many people, you know, have shared the gift that that book is in offering these, I don't know what to call them. They're each little gifts, but they're major, they're massive also in their own littleness. And so for this book to be something that isn't something you created for others to be able to receive and share, but that you created that is like letting us into your own home, your own, you know, it wasn't created with forward facing in mind. It was inner, and you are letting us in. That is such a gift, a generous gift. The other thing I want to just name before we come to the last part of our conversation today is that so many times when I was working on this book with you and I would get to certain sections, I would just be hit with the power of the questions you were asking, and the, you know, the theological questions and, you know, emotional terrain and all these things that I'm like, oh my gosh, like you are putting it out there, the things that we all are aching to know and understand, and in some ways can never know and understand. And I just think that that piece is also incredibly generous. And I know that this book, even though it's so personal to you, it just magnifies the universality of some of these big questions that we all ask. So thank you.
Thank you, Christianne.
Yeah.
And thank you for helping me get to that place. I think I think we might agree that that's so much of part of what the editing journey was how to convey that very personal, intimate, question-filled conversation that had been happening in that very personal kind of way, and how to invite others into that. Yeah, and starting with your you know, seeing a few pages from it and saying, this is what I want to see more, that you wanted to see.
I remember that.
So thank you for that, and for seeing the beginnings of what became that nest.
Well, the last piece we wanted to share with folks was just a little bit of a reading from the book, a little piece that you chose that you'd like to share with folks. So are you ready for that part?
I'm ready for that part.
Okay.
Yeah. This is from the last part of the introduction to Sparrow, and leading into it, I write a little bit about the circuitous nature of grief, how grief, I absolutely do not experience, I don't know anybody who does, I do not experience grief as anything resembling a straight line. I write in the introduction that grief is the least linear thing that I know, and unpredictable. There's no telling how grief is going to unfold, but it does unfold by spirals and circles, and we never know quite where it's going to take us. And I write in the introduction about how if there's no predictable and prescribed way to travel with our grief, then that actually frees us to navigate our grief in the way that works best for us. Which is its own journey, and that's so much of what Sparrow is about, is how do I live with this? How do I make a life with this incredible loss in a way that enables me to continue to carry Gary in that conversation with me, while also making this life one of the core questions for me. And Sparrow is, who am I? When the person who has seen me best and knows me best in all the world is gone from this world, you know, that is not getting to any kind of, I hesitate to use the word answer, because you don't really find answers to those kind of questions, but living with that question is anything but linear. And that, again, we're not bound to travel a path, the path of grief, in a way that doesn't work for us. And I go on to say this, what we are bound to is love, the love that gives rise to our grief, but finally goes deeper than it, the love that undergirds and carries us through every turning, As we learn to navigate our sorrow, love gives us the tools we need, the language, the images, the remedies, the particular forms of solace by which our particular hearts will find repair. I have found the most compelling repairs are the ones that make themselves visible, that leave evidence of the breakage and also of the imagination by which the breakage becomes transformed. Such repairs are always provisional, imperfect, and ongoing. Like a nest, they involve continual mending. They ask for a willingness to keep remaking what is perpetually at risk of falling apart. It is this remaking by which a home and a life may come, not in spite of what has gone before, but because of it.
Thank you, Jan. Well, I'm so happy the day is here for folks to get to read Sparrow, to bring it into their hearts, to share it, and to share with you what it's been like for them. So I just want to remind folks again, this is Sparrow's birthday. We're super excited and happy, but also, you know, it's bittersweet because of what gave rise to the birthing of Sparrow. And thank you to everyone who's here listening, sharing in this bittersweet joy day. Thank you, Jan, for the conversation. I want to remind folks, if you haven't had a chance to order your copy, you can find it on the books page on Jan's website at janrichardson.com. Thanks so much, everyone. Blessings on your day.
Thank you. Blessings.